Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio. Join hosts George Smart and Frank King as they talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Show your support by reviewing us at iTunes and visiting US Modernist's massive archives at usmodernist.org or on Instagram at mr.modernism. Today, US Modernist Radio welcomes documentary producer Michael Miner and National Modern Preservationist Liz Wayktus. And now, the guys who think fenestration is a Scandinavian surgical procedure, George Smart and Frank King.
You know, when we wrote that joke, we didn't realize that fenestration, which is about putting windows and openings in buildings, actually is a surgical procedure as well. I'm George Smart.
And I'm Frank King, and I am not looking forward to fenestration. Support for you. Nobody told me that when I took this gig. Support for U.S. Modernist Radio comes from Moho Realty. Are you having a hard time finding or selling a modernist home? Sarah Sonk of Moho Realty is a real estate agent who gets modern like you do. She loves these great houses and has the expertise, experience, and track record to close your deal. You can find her at mohorealty.com or 919-601-7339. And by U.S. Modernist Magazine Library, where we worked on collecting and scanning every major U.S. architecture magazine since 1930 because we have no lives. The library is searchable, downloadable, and completely free at usmodernist.org.
So what do you do with an architecturally amazing modernist building? Do you convert it to something else after 50 years? Do you try to save it like a time capsule? And what if your amazing building never got built in the first place? Do you build it? Do you dare to build it if a great master set out the vision to begin with? To paraphrase the movie Field of Dreams, if you build it, will they come? Our guests today take different approaches to masterworks of modern architecture. Michael Miner is a documentary filmmaker and since 2002 has devoted his career to the work of Frank Lloyd Wright. Miner first established himself in Hollywood with the screening of the short film Glycerin Tears at the 1991 Sundance Festival. He embarked on two major road trips, the first one in 1995, during which he visited Frank Lloyd Wright buildings all over America. These trips were the impetus for Miner's next project, the documentation of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. His first Frank Lloyd Wright film, Sacred Spaces, was completed in 2005, followed by A Child of the Sun, the story of the West Campus of Florida's Southern College in Lakeland, and finally Romanza, which was released in 2011. Miner has just finished up a fourth film called Masterpieces. Liz Wayktus is the executive director of Docomomo US, the leading preservation organization dedicated to modern architecture, landscapes, and design. In the last 6 years, she developed Docomomo programs such as the U.S. National Symposium and the Modernism in America Awards. She leads U.S. advocacy efforts in collaboration with local, national, and international preservation authorities, organizations, and professionals, and she is based in New York City. Some of her recent preservation victories include the Ambassador Grill near the United Nations. Michael and Liz, welcome to U.S. Modernist.
Thank you.
It's great to be on.
Hey, listen, Liz, I've got a question before we go any farther, because I got to ask. Docomomo, to a civilian, sounds like a delicious dessert topping. Yeah, I'd like some cheesecake with a Docomomo, please. Where did the name come from?
It's a quirky little name. You know, it's funny. Docomo is also the Japanese phone company, so I can't tell you how many times I get angry tweets saying someone's phone doesn't work. But no, the Docomomo is an acronym, and it stands for the Documentation and Conservation of the Modern Movement. And it was developed in the late 1980s in the Netherlands, where a few people were getting together because there was one particular building, the Zona Straal, that was deteriorating, and a group of people got together and said, "Hey, we need to start looking at these things." So all these years later, we have this quirky little moniker, but we enjoy it.
How did the idea get from the Netherlands over here, Liz?
To go back and read through, there's Docomomo International. So Docomomo is set up somewhat like the UN, which makes my sort of small job sound big to be to oversee the US chapter. But it started in Europe with a group of people, I believe primarily architects, maybe some architectural historians, looking at 20th century architecture, particularly, the modern movement. That phrase really defines the interwar period in Europe, and that's really where it started. They were looking at 20s, 30s, early 40s architecture. And then as they realized that there were, people that were interested in talking about modern architecture all over the world, I think there was an understanding that the modern movement really expanded across the globe over the course of, a few different decades. So they moved beyond that interwar period, but the modern movement remains. They would get together, I believe the first gathering was 1988 or 1989. And then Docomomo US really founded in 1995 when the National Park Service first hosted a conference called Preserving the Recent Past in Chicago. And really interestingly, they had 800 people gather. And you have to assume that was the first time in this country that people were getting together saying, wait, the modern movement deserves to be preserved just like, anything older in this country. So that's how we got started.
You said you're sort of like the UN. I haven't read the entire budget that Donald Trump proposed, but are you guys facing like large budget cuts if you're
well, good news, bad news. No, Docomomo US receives very little. This was actually the first year we received a grant from the National Park Service and NCPTT to help develop our brand new website that will actually launch this week, which is really exciting. But for the most part, we are supported by members across the United States. So we do programming that brings in modest amounts of money, but we're, we're small. We're a small organization, but it's actually really exciting to get together and have an international conference because everyone sits together at this crazy table and you have your country in front of you, and it's a thrill.
Now, Michael, I understand that there's another Michael Miner out there, just like on TV now. Adam F. Goldberg is always pursued by the other Adam Goldberg. Did they get you mixed up?
No, I do have an evil twin named Skippy, and we just use the same name. But yes, there is most notably Michael Miner, who wrote RoboCop back in the 1980s, and I'm often confused for him, as I mentioned. I forget the website that lists the film credits. Recently has been giving him credits for my Frank Lloyd Wright films, and I don't have a problem with that. As I say sometimes when I lecture, that when RoboCop first came out, I was not above telling young ladies that I was the one that wrote RoboCop. So right now it's just sort of like evening the score a little bit.
Yeah.
And I don't have, unfortunately, a clever euphonious acronym either. I only have FLWRI, so Liz has definitely got one up with Docomomo, which is just funny. It makes you smile when you say it, huh?
So, Michael, is that a great pickup line at a bar? Like, hi there, I produced RoboCop?
It would have been, 30 years ago. I don't think it carries much weight now. The Frank Lloyd Wright probably gets people more excited now, I think.
I understand you fell in love with Frank Lloyd Wright's work because you were dating a woman who is into it. And don't feel bad, because that is the reason I have a master's in modern dance. So,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
no. Did she really introduce you to Frank Lloyd Wright? I mean, is that a true story?
In essence, she did. I was, like everyone else in the world, I was introduced to Frank Lloyd Wright in 7th grade humanities class, where they show you Falling Water and the Guggenheim Museum, the house that was built over a waterfall, and the museum where you take an elevator to the top and you walk a spiral down. And that was basically it. But when I was dating somebody, when I lived in Los Angeles, her grandmother actually was a great fan of Frank Lloyd Wright and started giving me books on Frank Lloyd Wright. And so I was immediately captivated once I was exposed to a more thorough picture of what Wright was all about. So never had the opportunity to visit except the local buildings. And when that relationship broke up in the mid-'90s, I embarked on one of the road trips that you were talking about and was able during that time to visit not only the high-profile Frank Lloyd Wright buildings, but a number of the ones that were out in the middle of nowhere. For example, the Cedar Rock, which is in Quasqueton, Iowa, extraordinarily small town. It was a weekend home, as Falling Water was, and therefore it's in a very remote area. So that trip gave me the opportunity to see all of these out-of-the-way sites, and that was the seed that was planted for doing the films some years later.
And you produce 4 films now.
Up to 4, yeah.
When you did The Child of the Sun, which is about Florida Southern College, it's in Lakeland, Florida, between Tampa and Orlando.
Right.
What impressed you about that campus?
The most notable feature is that it is the largest site of a multi-building design by Frank Lloyd Wright, the largest single site. I think it was 9 or 10 buildings, 18 or 20 were envisioned, but over the 20 years that the buildings were built, only about half were realized. And what's fascinating about that is that Mr. Wright always looked at his buildings as a single thing that were made up of different components. Well, he looked at the multiple building configuration the same way. He didn't look at them as individual buildings. He looked at them as individual components to a large, complete composition. In the same way that a room, the dining room or the living room or the area of the living room and dining room and the kitchen and so on and so forth comprised a house, each of these buildings, which had their own function, comprised a campus, and they were all connected by this wonderful series of covered walkways called esplanades, which themselves are a unique Frank Lloyd Wright design. So it's a wonderful place to visit for that reason, and I think my film helped point out some of the deficiencies and some of the deterioration that had taken place in the buildings. And when it came out, I think it sort of pushed the college to begin their restoration of the site. And since then, they've created one new building and are in the process of completely overhauling the campus and trying to put it together, or put it back to its original intent.
Yes, I recall visiting there a couple of years ago, and there were some very unfortunate renovations and additions to the Wright buildings around the campus.
Exactly, yes. Horrible, inappropriate, paneling over some of the textile block, and just the kind of neglect that happens after 70 years, 60 years of wear and tear. And of course, Mr. Wright's buildings were famous for kind of deteriorating a lot faster than other people's buildings over time. So, like I say, though, I think we pointed them in the right direction. I don't know to what extent our film, helped push them that way. But the net point is they're doing the right thing now, and we couldn't be more happy with that.
Let's move north from Florida to New York. Liz, the Ambassador Grill is a restaurant not everybody has gone to, but if you work in the United Nations, you probably heard of it, and it has some particular historical significance that you were involved in maintaining. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the Ambassador Grill is in the it's the restaurant in 1 UN Plaza, which was a development built once they decided the UN was going to go into New York. Of course, they would need support services and office buildings, residential. And Kevin Roach was picked to design. It's a series of 3 buildings, and the restaurant itself was completed in 1974. It is what you would consider late modern, so it still retains a lot of those simple, clear, just beautiful lines, but with a little bit of flourish thrown in there. There's some twinkling lights and a little bit of brass and some marble. So we're definitely talking late modern. And interestingly enough, that space really it was a little time capsule. The various hotels that use and own and operate the restaurant had maintained it as it was since the 70s. And just incredible to be able to walk in there and see all these glittering lights. It's in the basement. And it has this really beautiful faux skylight. And that sounds ridiculous. And if you look at the pictures online, it's hard to understand, but you walk in there and it is just a breathtaking space. It was on Docomomo's radar for a number of years. I think there was a point in 2012 where the hotel said, we need to upgrade this. Of course, their clientele wants to have better services. It needed to be fixed up, but that never happened. And then in late 2015, the restaurant did close, and we just sort of jumped into preservation mode. We wrote a 20-30 page description of the interior, sent them off to the New York Landmarks Preservation Commission, and said, please, let's stop this. This is just an incredible resource that Ada Louise Huxtable, Paul Goldberger, plenty of people said was one of the most incredible dining rooms in all of New York, I believe, since the opening of the Four Seasons. So we had just lost the Four Seasons that had just closed. So, and we were skeptical of how our application would be received. It is late modern. It's moving into postmodern. The lobby areas are certainly have more postmodern elements. But we were pleasantly surprised that the commission really took the Ambassador Grill as an example of this idea that, landmarks continue, that we're not done landmarking, and that there's a point at which, if a interior is done well, it stands the test of time. You get to that 20-30 year mark, and I think, as Michael was talking about, people don't necessarily, and they're too close to it, and they say, oh, this is ugly, we have to cover it up. And they really wanted to use the Ambassador Grill as an example of landmarks continuing. So at I think it was actually just this January, the Landmarks Preservation Commission voted to make the interiors of the Ambassador Grill New York City's 118th interior landmark, which is a very special designation. And for the thousands of designations in New York City, being number 118, that's a really small number, was just incredible. It's open now. It's all the way over kitty corner from the UN. So if you're over there, 44th Street and First Avenue, head on in, take a look around. And you can stay there as a hotel. It's really, it's quite amazing.
Hey, Michael, on your movie Romanza, you oversaw the reconstruction of a very interesting structure for a dog.
Yes, we did. Actually, was my first jump into doing a Frank Lloyd Wright demolished structure, rebuilding it as part of Romanza. The Robert Berger House in San Anselmo was one of obviously the major buildings, but in 1956, while that house was being built by the owner, which itself was a wonderful story. He took about 20 years, Robert Berger, and built the house literally by himself. His 12-year-old son, Jim, wrote a letter to Frank Lloyd Wright asking Frank Lloyd Wright to design a doghouse that would be incorporated into the house for his dog, Eddie. And surprisingly, Frank Lloyd Wright sent him blueprints for the doghouse. Wow. The doghouse was subsequently built years later after Jim had gone off to join the Army. Was built by his father, Robert, and one of his brothers, Steve. And subsequently, 10 years later, after Robert had passed away, the Gloria, the wife, got tired of the doghouse and had it taken to the dump. So, unfortunately, not realizing, obviously, the significance for the Frank Lloyd Wright community and the world at large. So we told that story in the film, and then our climax of the film was revealing that we had Jim, along with his other brother Eric, rebuild the doghouse, and we presented it back in its rightful place on the side of the Berger home. So it was a nice finish to the film. I always like to have a happy ending in my films. So,
but it sounds like this was a transition point, Michael, from being not just a filmmaker but being a builder, because you are now trying to actually take an unbuilt Frank Lloyd Wright structure and get it built, and this one for people, not just dogs.
Yeah, I never thought about that, but I guess that was certainly the first effort, and maybe it was sort of a linear connection to what I'm doing now. But yes, in 2013, I went to Banff, Canada, where a pavilion designed by Mr. Wright in 1914, I believe it was, existed for about 25 years. It was demolished in the late 30s. And for various controversial reasons, it's still not absolutely certain why that happened. But it always struck me as a wonderful building, relatively simple in design, and we decided that would be a good building to use as our pilot project, so to speak. So again, going back to 2013, I visited Banff and presented the idea to the town council, the town manager, planning commission, and was told later that it was more or less dead on arrival. There was no interest in doing the building whatsoever. But I was persistent. I kept on them. I contacted them from time to time. And then last year in March, for some reason, suddenly I started to get calls from the press and people in the town council offices asking me about the project. Apparently what happened was the site that the building, the original building stood, was a sports field, flat and a lot of open land around, which was very good. Nothing substantial had been built on that site. They decided they were going to rehabilitate the site, and one of the things they were going to add was a recreation center. Someone remembered my proposal from a few years before and said, well, this guy says there was a Frank Lloyd Wright building here. The Frank Lloyd Wright building could probably serve as a recreation building, and maybe we could incorporate it into our larger project. And they called me, and they passed the resolution approving the project. And so I was kind of caught off guard. And at that point, I formed the Revival Initiative. I hadn't done so because I didn't have a viable project to actually execute. And since then, we've been fundraising and trying to bring awareness to the project. I finished up my fourth film, so I'll be lecturing this year, doing a number of lectures, and obviously that will be a topic which I will bring up and we'll talk at length about during the tour. So I'm looking forward to the year. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Liz, has Docomomo, either in New York or elsewhere around the world, tried to bring back an unbuilt building?
I can't say that Docomomo has. We've certainly restored buildings that were almost lost, completely lost. Zona Strahl is an excellent example, and that was led by... It's in the Netherlands. And it was awarded one of the World Monuments Fund has a Knoll Award for modern architecture, which won that a few years back. But as far as a building that was never built to restore it, I can't say we have. Maybe models, we've probably supported some models being built, but not anything, not a full structure.
Liz, can I ask, interrupt here? I know that, I guess it's not really within your purview, but someone is apparently proposing rebuilding Penn Station and several blocks around that. Are you familiar with that?
Well, I'm familiar with the proposal. They're gonna, I think they're gonna take the Farley post office and turn it into Penn Station. I'm too young to have ever gone through Penn Station. Of course, Penn Station in New York, which is the birth of the modern preservation movement in the United States. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't, Docomomo, the building would have been 20th century, early 20th century. That's a question for Docomomo. We were founded looking at modern architecture. We were looking at high modern, the masters, Frank Lloyd Wright, certainly, Marcel Breuer, Mies. And that has, at least in the last few years, there's a question there with, looking at the Ambassador Grill, that's late modern. Should we be expanding and looking at bringing more into what we're discussing? So Art Deco we get into a little bit. So, it'll be interesting to see. Well, certainly we need another Penn Station. That's just a mess down there. But as far as Docomomo getting involved in that or other projects is sort of on the fringe of modernism, I think you're going to continue to see that happen.
Liz, what are some of the other buildings that Docomomo has helped save around the country?
Well, Docomomo has been involved in projects for more than 20 years. I mean, primarily, you could make, you could point to structures like TWA, the Aero Saarinen designed terminal at JFK Airport. You could point, beautiful. And at one point, incredibly threatened. I mean, it's incredible to think now that could be threatened. Other buildings like Marcel Breuer's Atlanta Public Library, that we've been talking about that building for years. But primarily what Docomomo, our influence is just general education. We became this voice that as preservation, really bloomed in the United States. It's a young country. What do we have to preserve? It's, who needs this stuff? We're going to just keep building, right? That's what the administration wants us to think. But no, we have, incredible works of architecture, 18th, 19th, and, 20th century architecture is really the modern era. I mean, the American era, all of this work. So what Docomomo primarily, our influence is education. So we support other organizations, give them a platform where if they have a building that's 20th century, maybe their local members and political affiliations don't necessarily see, a big concrete building as having any kind of architectural value, cultural value, and so we give them support. George, you're one of our long-standing friends organizations that we work with, and I think that's really the legacy of Docomomo, that we're here, that we consolidate. We really we're elevating everyone so that at some point there's a general understanding that 20th century architecture, modern architecture is valuable and should continue to be preserved.
I think you're being too polite about it. I think that education is absolutely a foundation. But, when you mention things like, why we have to defend the idea of defending architecture, what is wrong with people? I mean, they're works of art. That's why you defend them. They never should be threatened in the first place. So I guess I'm getting my angry side that's built up. It's like, again, gosh, guys, it's like art is art. Art is the only hope that mankind has when it boils down to it. It's like, why do we have to defend our efforts? It's like, get it together and realize, the difference between a good building and a bad building, and good music and bad music, and so on and so forth. But, I don't know. Just the world has got to get itself in gear here. It's there's a polite way of doing it, which sounds like what Liz is talking about, and I think that's fine. But I'm personally am going to becoming more aggressive. I think in confrontational, I guess, with people who have that different attitude, and trying to quote unquote educate them. So,
well, look anyway. For Michael Miner on America's Most Wanted coming this fall.
It could happen. Could happen.
But could I also just add, I completely agree, but it's a taste cycle. And, the example that I give for Docomomo is even 2-3 years ago, we started looking at postmodern architecture because it's threatened. Even in myself, I'd look at something that was postmodern and I'd be like, that's a monstrosity. It needs to go. I mean, that was my own taste, and I think I've realized that it's taste, and that art is art. You need to get your own personal issues out of the way to say art is art, and it all needs to be saved. So I would agree with that.
Michael, if people want to support your effort to bring these Frank Lloyd Wright buildings into reality, how can they reach you? How can they support you?
Well, they can buy my films, which are available on designedbyfranklloydwright.com, which will help support me since I'm not taking a salary from the initiative. My wife, who is also on the board, is not taking a salary. No one is taking a salary, and we're not going to profit from it. Then, of course,
it sounds like us here at the US Modernist.
Exactly. You better do it for love because you don't get any money out of it. The website for the Revival Initiative itself is FLW, Mr. Wright's initials, FLW Revival Initiative, spelled out, .org, and there is a donate button. And actually, we are introducing some special art prints that have been very popular, which will be either available for purchase or a thank you gift for someone who donates at a certain level in the near future. So look for that. I'll have more information on both those sites, and then of course as I'm going around lecturing around the country. So that's a nice step that we're looking forward to too.
And Liz, how can people get involved in Docomomo?
Well, Docomomo is a membership organization. It's a fairly small fee to become an annual member, $75. So you can get involved that way. That is really how we continue to operate. You can also get involved in Docomomo either by getting involved in your local Docomomo chapter. We have 17 chapters across the country, and then we have an additional 6 what we call friends organizations. George, you're one of our friends. We like to call you friends with benefits.
Wow. Awesome.
Yeah, how much for that level? Yeah, I'm in.
All right. Well, I want to thank our guests, Michael Miner and Liz Wayktus. You guys were great. We'll have you back again.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. A lot of fun.
US Modernist Radio is underwritten by the amazing Sarah Sonk, the real estate agent who loves modernist houses just as much as you do. 919-601-7339. And by US Modernist Magazine Library, where we're working on collecting and scanning every major U.S. architecture magazine since 1930. The library is searchable, downloadable, and completely free at usmodernist.org. Thanks for listening. I'm George Smart with Frank King. In 2 weeks, more poolside interviews from Modernism Week 2017 in Palm Springs. Okay, take us out, Tom.
Ooh la la! US Modernist Radio is edited by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. You can visit us at usmodernist.org. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. US Modernist Radio is a production of North Carolina Modernist Houses, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. Show your support by writing a great review of us on iTunes. It's free. George and Frank and I will be back in 2 weeks for another high-fiber, low-sugar, high-protein, low-fat, cage-free edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.